Well, thank you, Jim, and thank you, 60 Plus, and happy birthday to Social Security. Hope I make it to 76. I also have three parts to my remarks. Anyone who talks about the system at this point in time has to document the problems that are out there and spend a little time on that. Then I want to, for the purposes of framing the debate, talk a little bit about what I think are the five crucial decisions that one has to make in thinking about the future of Social Security. And once you go through that list, you'll know where you stand in terms of reforms, and I'll close with some thoughts about the way I think the United States should go. But let me just start with the problems. The top problem that you hear so much about is the financial condition of Social Security. And there are many different numbers. There are a gazillion different metrics, and it is absolutely, positively easy to get completely baffled by what is going on. So the simplest way to think about this is that revenues in the system are about 5% of GDP as far as the eye can see. So that's line number one. And line number two, which is benefits that have to come out, used to be about 4.5%. We used to run surpluses. But the surpluses are gone. Benefits are now above the revenue coming in, and they're going to rise to about 6.5% of GDP. And so the problem is that benefits are here and revenues are here as far as the eye can see. Now, you can add that up for 75 years, or you can do Buzz Lightyear math and add it up to infinity and beyond and get all kinds of different numbers. But the policy problem is very simple. We have promised benefits that exceed the revenues for the system as far as the eye can see, and that has to be addressed somehow. I'll come back to that, but I think there are problems that get lost inside of that are also equally important. The first is that there are very different problems in the retirement part of the system, which is about 83% of the spending, and the disability part of Social Security, which is about 17%, and often disability gets lost in this discussion. I'm not a disability insurance expert, won't pretend to be one, but anyone talking about Social Security reform has to remember this isn't one thing, and that the reforms have to be done in conjunction with one another, and we have to get that right in doing a reform. Second thing to remember is that Social Security is a powerful government policy, and as a result has powerful incentives for the functioning of the economy. It affects how much we save, it affects how much we work and how long we work, and we ought to think about the economic incentives that we are presenting people with when we do Social Security reform, and not just count the dollars in and the dollars out for purposes of doing the financial accounting. And it troubles me sometimes when we forget that this is such an important part of our economy. Third thing that I think Jared mentioned, but I want to emphasize, is that most people who look at the system end up coming to the conclusion that the minimum benefit is too low. So that when you're doing reforms in the face of financial difficulties, step one is to make them worse and actually over time raise the minimum benefit and then figure out how you're going to make the rest of it add up, because I think there's a universal agreement that this part of the system has to be addressed. And then lastly, I think the key problems are really problems of uncertainty in the political process. And as Jim put at the outset, we're not here to talk politics, but the fact that we don't fix Social Security, the fact that we now have workers uncertain about the nature of the deal they're going to have in Social Security when they retire, is a disservice to everyone. And that uncertainty is bad economics, it's bad policy, and it ought to be resolved as quickly as possible. And indeed, every year that we delay in fixing the system, we make things harder. And so we should address the fact that the failure to reform Social Security and put it on a solid and sustainable footing is bad policy in and of itself. So what do you need to do to fix it? Well, you just have to go through the list and decide where you're going to be. Step number one is how much are you going to do on the tax side and how much you're going to do on the benefit side. And there are lots of ways to disguise those things, but in the end, you have to make a decision about where you come down on that. That is the most politically charged of the decisions that a Congress will ultimately have to make in reforming Social Security. Step two, which is different but equally charged, is whether you want to continue the practice of funding Social Security on a pay-as-you-go basis where current workers pay the benefits of current retirees, or do you want to move to a system that pre-funds where each individual pays for their own Social Security in retirement? If you make a decision about that, you dictate a lot of your ability to handle the financial problems of Social Security. The problem, again, is on a pay-as-you-go basis, the revenues coming in are not enough to cover the benefits going out. If you decide to move to a pre-funded system where I pay for my own retirement or someone else pays for theirs, that problem hasn't gone away. So now you have two things you have to pay for, current retirees and your own retirement, and you have to figure out how to solve that problem. Third decision you have to make, how progressive do you want the system to be? Just how much in the way of benefits and taxes do you want to assign to each part of the income distribution, and whether, the system is currently progressive in its overall nature, but you could make it even more progressive. You could, for example, not make it a universal program by not providing benefits to very high-income individuals. That will make for a very contentious political debate, but that's the nature of a decision you have to make and where you come down with that. Fourth one is what kind of incentives you want to present people with. Work incentives, work longer, retirement ages, things like that. Probably no real political heat there because it's hard to get the political class excited about the things that Jared and I spent our younger years mastering, but it is an important part of it. And then lastly, how are you going to handle the transition from what we have now to any reform system? To what extent will you exempt those currently retired? Most people would conclude, absolutely, you cannot change that deal. How about those near retirement? Well, the sort of standard operating procedure in Social Security proposals for the past decade has been you exempt those near to retirement, and that's been defined as 55 or older. That, I think, is a very important decision when you make that, because it absolutely increases the urgency of doing Social Security reform quicker and quicker. Because in the end, the fundamental problem is the demography. It's the retirement of the baby boom generation. I am the trailing edge of the baby boom generation. I'm 53 years old. So if you grandfather anyone 55 or older, you have 2 years to get Doug Holtz Eakin, or you've grandfathered the baby boom, which means you've grandfathered the problem. And so my bumper sticker for Social Security reform has always been get Doug Holtz Eakin. And I think that this increases the urgency that we see action and see action quickly. So where do I come down on solutions? Well, I'm going to agree with some that Jared mentioned and offer some others. First of all, I agree we should always run government programs with accurate measures of inflation, prices, wages, whatever it may be. So I endorse the highly geeky chain CPI. Every American should become familiar with that term. I would favor slimming benefits in a highly progressive way. Certainly, you could change the benefit formula to have a lower replacement rate for high lifetime earners. You could do the proposal by Mr. Posen for a mixture of wage and price indexing of the initial benefit in retirement. I'm pretty much indifferent about how you do it, but I think that having a universal program that is less generous to the affluent is absolutely a sensible way to go. I, at least, would raise the normal retirement age, but would retain the same early retirement age and worry a lot about the line between the disability program and the retirement program as you do this, because I think Jared's observations on longevity are matched by things we know about the correlations between health and wealth and the strong positive association. And you want to make sure you have this well-calibrated across the income distribution. I'd raise the minimum benefit, as I said before. I think you have to do that. And I, at least, would add on a private investment account with an additional payroll tax, an add-on account, not using the existing Social Security payroll structure, because we don't have adequate retirement savings either on the personal side or in the employer retirement system, and we need to find different ways to give people both access to the higher on-average rate of return equities with the acknowledgement that there's risk there. We've all seen that. But also to just expand the base of the retirement security. Now, things not on that list, you'll notice, are raising the payroll tax rate or raising the cap, and here's why. I mean, one possible reason is I'm a crazy right-wing Republican. It's actually not it.
Yeah. That's my reason.
I knew that. I thought I'd preempt that, Jared. We, in fact, do face, in my view, an incredibly threatening fiscal outlook. Every one of our social safety net programs, Social Security is running red ink, Medicare runs $280 billion of red ink a year, Medicaid is essentially being paid for by our children now, entirely debt financed. These programs are a disservice to their beneficiaries because we cannot rely on them to be there for the next generation of poor and elderly. They often don't serve their constituencies well. Medicaid is by no one's idea of a good health program. And we're going to have to reform all of these in some deep and fundamental ways, and we simply cannot tax our way out of these problems. There is no projection that I've ever seen that you could sensibly say the solution is tax our way out of it. It may be the case that we're going to have to raise some taxes in the process of dealing with our problems. And I think both the Domenici-Rivlin and the Bowles-Simpson commissions provided an important lesson there where they said, if you want to talk about higher revenues, the route is through tax reform. It is not in jacking up the existing tax structures. And I take that lesson seriously, and so I avoid going there on the Social Security payroll tax. And I also am painfully aware that the place where we're most likely to need more revenue to cover a spending problem is going to be in Medicare, Medicaid, and health programs in general. So if you've got that risk, I don't think you start out by solving it in Social Security. I think you reserve that for the place where it's most likely to raise its head. So that I would do this on the benefit side, and there are many plans out there that show you could add this up and make it work. In closing, let me just talk a little bit about Jared's idea and the Domenici-Rivlin plan of exposing the employer-sponsored health insurance to tax. I hope there are no PhD-trained economists who argue that it's a good idea to have an open-ended tax subsidy to any activity that is more generous to the rich than to the poor. And that's exactly what our current tax treatment of employer-sponsored health insurance is. So it is, in the eyes of most analysts, bad health policy. It is certainly bad tax policy, and one certainly ought to, as part of the tax reform I mentioned earlier, absolutely change that tax treatment and find different ways, if you want to subsidize health insurance, to target that subsidy more effectively across the income distribution and to make people more cost conscious at the margins. I think that's very important. Domenici-Rivlin included the payroll tax in that reform. Paul Ryan included the payroll tax in his proposed reform. So this is not new, and certainly, in the spirit of putting everything on the table, I certainly think that should be on the list. If my guess is, though, when you finally collect $1 of taxes off employer-sponsored health insurance, it's going to go out the federal door under a health care label before it goes out under Social Security, because that's where our biggest problems are. But I want to, again, thank everyone for the chance to be here today. It is always a pleasure to listen to Jared and then disagree with him, and I look forward to the discussion.
Oh, okay.